December 20th, 1944. A frozen clearing in the Ardennes forest. A German captain named Otto Hallmann crouches behind a snowdrift with field glasses pressed to his eyes, watching something he cannot explain. 200 meters across the clearing, 12 American soldiers are pinned down behind a railway embankment. He has counted them. He knows their officer is dead. He watched the lieutenant fall 30 minutes ago, cut down by his unit's MG-42 fire. He saw the body slump and lie still on the snow. By every rule of war Hallmann was taught at the infantry school in Derberitz, those 12 Americans should now be doing one of three things. They should be retreating, they should be surrendering, or they should be huddled exactly where they are, waiting for a new officer to be sent forward from the rear. Instead, they are doing something his binoculars cannot quite register. They are moving. 2 of them have crawled into a drainage ditch and disappeared. 3 others have shifted left where the embankment dips and are now firing into the woods on his right flank. A sergeant, Hallmann can see the stripes on the man's sleeve through the snow flurries, has crawled back the other direction and is gesturing to a rifleman with a Browning automatic rifle, who is taking up a new firing position 20 meters away. Nobody is shouting, nobody is using a radio, the lieutenant is still dead. And yet, in front of the captain's eyes, the squad is reorganizing itself, on its own, into a flanking ambush aimed precisely at the German machine gun nest that just killed its officer. Hallmann lowers the field glasses. He turns to his runner, a 19-year-old named Karl, and says something that German officers in 3 other clearings, in 3 other engagements that same brutal week, are saying almost word for word. He says in German, "Wer führt dies Männer?" Who is commanding these men? Karl does not have an answer, neither does the captain. Neither, by January of 1945, will any of the senior German generals gathered in secret at a converted English country house north of London, where British intelligence officers are recording every word the prisoners say without their knowledge. Because the question that captain whispered in the snow that morning is the question this entire investigation turns on. The Wehrmacht was the army that invented the modern concept of decentralized command. The doctrine had a name, Auftragstaktik, mission tactics. Tell a subordinate what to accomplish, never tell him how, and trust him to figure out the rest. Germans had been training their officers in this idea for more than a century. They had built the most flexible command system on Earth. They had used it to conquer France in 6 weeks and to push to the gates of Moscow in 5 months. And by the autumn of 1944, when their own captains were looking across snowfields and hedgerows at American squads operating without visible orders, they could not understand what they were watching. Not because the Americans had done something the Germans did not know how to do, but because the Americans had done something the Germans had quietly stopped being able to do, and had, in some essential way, perhaps never done at quite that level at all. To understand why a German captain in the Ardennes was calling out into the snow, asking who was in charge of those Americans, we need to go back not to D-Day, not even to the entry of the United States into the war. We need to go back to a Prussian general staff officer in 1806, and to a single catastrophic afternoon outside a small German town called Jena, which would, almost a century and a half later, quietly decide what happened in that clearing in the Ardennes. This is the story of how the United States Army broke the German command system using a version of the German command system, and of why, in the end, the men who had invented mission tactics watched the men who were never supposed to understand them do it better. We have to begin with a sentence that should sound impossible. The American small unit initiative that confused German officers in 1944 was, in its bones, a German idea. October 14, 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte destroyed the Prussian army at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. It was an annihilation. The army of Frederick the Great, the most drilled parade ground machine in Europe, met an enemy that refused to fight by the rules and was shattered in a single afternoon. 25,000 Prussian casualties. The fortress at Magdeburg surrendered without firing a shot because its commander could not get authorization from a king who no longer effectively existed. The Prussian officer corps, sifting through the wreckage, made one of the most consequential observations in the history of warfare. They had been trained to wait for orders. Napoleon's officers had been trained to think. When the situation changed in front of a Prussian colonel, the colonel froze. When the situation changed in front of a French marshal, that marshal acted. The Prussians made a decision. They were going to copy what had just killed them. The men at the center of that copying were Gerhard von Scharnhorst and his protégé Karl von Clausewitz, who would later write the book every military professional on Earth still argues about. Together, they tore the Prussian army apart and rebuilt it around a different principle. War is chaos. The plan never survives contact with the enemy. The man at the highest level cannot possibly know what is happening at the lowest level fast enough to react, so you do not try. You give the man at the lowest level a clear understanding of why he is fighting and what his commander wants accomplished, and you let him figure out how. It took 60 years and several wars to refine. But by the time Helmuth von Moltke, the elder, took command of the Prussian army in the 1860s, the system had a doctrine and a name: Auftragstaktik. Mission tactics, an order, Moltke wrote, that can be misunderstood will be misunderstood. Therefore, do not give detailed orders, give intent, give purpose, give the result you want. Then get out of the way of the man who has to make it happen. There is a story every German cadet learned that captures the philosophy. Prince Frederick Charles of Prussia was berating a major for committing a tactical error during a maneuver. The major protested that he was only following orders. The prince replied, "His Majesty made you a major because he believed you would know when not to obey his orders." Read that line again. That is the heart of the German military tradition that would conquer most of Europe in the late 1930s. It was the opposite of the rigid, click-the-heels robot soldier image that post-war movies would later attach to German troops. The real Wehrmacht doctrine, the doctrine they actually trained their best officers in, said that an order which no longer fit the situation in front of you was not binding. You were obligated to disregard it and accomplish what the order had been intended to accomplish. By 1933, this doctrine had been codified into a manual called Truppenführung, troop leadership, which remains one of the most studied military documents ever written. It said plainly, war is the realm of friction and uncertainty. The commander on the spot must be free to decide. Initiative is the duty of every officer and every NCO. Hesitation is a greater sin than a wrong decision actively taken. When the Wehrmacht crashed into Poland in September 1939, the system was put to its first major test. American military analysts produced a report on the Polish campaign that has been quoted in every Army doctrine paper since. They wrote that the Germans had developed leadership and initiative in commanders during years of preparatory training, and that all commanders from the highest to the lowest echelons felt free to carry out their missions or meet changes in situations with a minimum of interference from above. The Americans wrote it down, they circulated it, and then most of them filed it and went back to drilling soldiers in parade ground formations. When France fell 6 weeks after the German invasion in May 1940, the world saw what Auftragstaktik could do at its peak. Erwin Rommel, then a divisional commander, was famously found 50 kilometers ahead of his own headquarters because he believed his place was at the front, where the situation was changing minute by minute. German junior officers were tearing across northern France, making their own decisions about which roads to take, which bridges to seize, which French units to bypass. The French, by contrast, were operating on a command cycle that took 24 hours to convert a frontline observation into an order. They were always fighting yesterday's battle. This was the German army that Americans first met in February 1943 in the snow and dust of a Tunisian mountain pass called Kasserine. American officers had read the report on Poland. They knew on paper what they were facing. It did not save them. The result was the worst single defeat the United States Army would suffer on the Western Front in the entire war. American forces were shattered, scattered across 30 miles of desert. 6,500 men lost in 5 days, more than 200 tanks destroyed or abandoned. German commanders looked at the wreckage and concluded what their analysts had been telling them for 2 years. The Americans had factories. They did not have soldiers. They had wealth. They did not have warriors. The Wehrmacht referred to American troops as the Dollar Army. and it was not a compliment. And here is the thing you need to hold on to, the thing that makes the rest of this story extraordinary. 18 months after Kasserine, in the hedgerows of Normandy and the snowfields of the Ardennes, German captains would be staring through binoculars at American squads, 12 men. The smallest tactical unit in the entire army, and they would not be able to figure out who was in charge. They would not be able to predict what the squad would do next. They would not be able to identify the leader because there did not appear to be one. The men would simply move as if they all knew the same thing without having been told. What had changed? That is the question we have to answer. And the first piece of the answer arrived on a beach in Normandy on the morning of June 6, 1944, when an entire American assault regiment landed in the wrong place, lost almost all of its officers in the first 10 minutes, and did something its German defenders had no doctrinal category for. Omaha Beach, 6:30 hours. The first wave of a company, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division. The Stonewallers, descendants of the Confederate brigade once commanded by Stonewall Jackson, came down the ramps of their landing craft into a kill zone that German planners had spent 3 years designing. The official Army historian's account of what happened next is one of the most harrowing documents in the entire institutional record of the United States military. Within 10 minutes of the ramps dropping, a company had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Every officer was a casualty. Every sergeant was a casualty. The men who could still move were lying in the surf, some hidden behind beach obstacles, some behind the bodies of the men who had died beside them. Some had crawled to the seawall, the small shingle embankment of round stones that ran along the back of the beach, and were pinned there by interlocking machine gun fire from the bluffs above. By every German calculation about American troops, what should have happened next was simple. With its officers dead, a company was supposed to break. The men were supposed to lie there paralyzed until enough of them surrendered to be marched off the beach as prisoners, or until the tide came in and drowned the wounded. This was, in fact, what the German defenders of the wider Stanzenist strong points had been told to expect from American conscripts. American soldiers, the German training memo said, would not function without their officers. Decapitate the leadership and the unit collapses. That is not what happened. What actually happened all along the 5 miles of Omaha that morning is one of the most extraordinary collective acts of small unit improvisation in the history of warfare. The men did not break. They did not surrender. They did not, for the most part, even retreat. Instead, in groups of 2 and 3 and 5 and 10, with no orders, no plan, no contact with anyone above them, they made the same decision independently and almost simultaneously. They decided that staying on the beach was death. They decided that someone had to lead. And they decided, each of them in their own piece of the line, that the someone was going to have to be them. There is a story that Stephen Ambrose recorded in his oral history of D-Day that captures it. Sergeant Lewis of the 116th was lying in the shingle when a lieutenant named Leo Van de Voort, who Sergeant Lewis did not know and had not been under the command of 5 minutes earlier, stood up and said in words that would become almost a folk saying in the 29th Division afterward, "Let's go, goddamn, there ain't no use staying here. We're all going to get killed." Then the lieutenant ran up to a German gun emplacement and threw a grenade through the embrasure. He did not consult anyone. He did not request authorization. He looked at the situation, and he made the decision a German cadet in the 1860s had been told he would have to make if his country ever asked him to fight. And the men around him, who had every cultural and bureaucratic excuse to do nothing, followed. It happened over and over. Brigadier General Norman, Dutch, Coda, the assistant commander of the 29th Division, came ashore in the second wave, walked through the chaos as if he were on a country road, and started organizing groups of leaderless men by sheer force of personality. At one point, finding a knot of Rangers from the 5th Ranger Battalion lying behind the seawall. He is supposed to have said the words that the United States Army Rangers would later adopt as their official motto. "Rangers, lead the way," Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, the commander of the 5th Rangers, had already made an even more important decision. His battalion had been ordered to land at Point du Hoc to support the cliff assault there, But the guideboat had been lost, and the cliffs were already a closed engagement. Schneider could have waited for new orders. He could have circled offshore. Instead, he diverted his entire battalion 1,000 yards east to a less defended sector of Omaha, Dog Red, and saved the lives of probably 400 of his own men by doing it. He did not ask anyone's permission. He looked at the situation and he changed the plan. But the part that should make you stop and think, the part that German officers, when they began debriefing their own surviving prisoners months later, kept circling back to with something that sounds in the transcripts almost like awe, was not the generals and not the colonels. The generals and the colonels were the part the Germans understood. Every army has officers who will improvise. The part the Germans could not place was what was happening at the squad level. It was happening with privates. A young man named Private Carlton Barrett of the 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, 25 years old, from upstate New York. No special training, no rank. Landed in deep water under fire, dropped his rifle, and instead of trying to save himself, spent the rest of the morning swimming back into the surf to drag wounded men ashore. Nobody told him to do it. Nobody could have told him to do it. The chain of command around him no longer functioned. He decided what the situation required, and he did it. He would receive the Medal of Honor for those hours, one of 3 given for actions on Omaha Beach that day. In another sector, a private from F Company of the 116th. His name has not survived in the records, only his action. Looked at the seawall, looked at the bluff above, looked at the men around him, and stood up and said, "They're killing us here. Let's get inland and get killed." Then he started up the bluff, other men followed. By the time they reached the top, they had improvised a small assault force out of riflemen who had been in 3 different platoons that morning and who were now answering to a private who had not been a leader an hour earlier and would not be one again 2 days later. There are, by the count of the official Army history, dozens of these moments along Omaha that morning. They have one thing in common. None of them were ordered. None of them came from a plan. They came from individual men, in individual fragments of the line, who looked at the situation and made a decision they were not formally authorized to make. When German prisoners were interrogated about Omaha later that summer, the question that came up over and over from the German side was a strange one for soldiers from a country that had invented Auftragstaktik. The Germans kept asking American intelligence officers who was in command of those small units, who told them what to do. American interrogators initially thought it was a strange question. Then they began to understand that the Germans were not asking for a tactical name. They were asking for a category. They wanted to know what slot in the chain of command those private soldiers had been operating from. Because the Germans, despite their doctrine, despite Auftragstaktik, despite 140 years of telling themselves that initiative was the duty of every soldier, had never quite believed that initiative meant the man who actually did the fighting. They had built a system that empowered captains and majors and Oberleutnants. They had not built a system that empowered the men in the foxhole. The Americans had not built a system at all. That is what makes it strange. The Americans had something else. What it was and where it came from is the part of the story that started to become visible in the hedgerows of Normandy 6 weeks after Omaha, when German divisions found themselves losing position after position to American small units that were not following any doctrine the Germans recognized. July 1944, the hedgerows of Normandy, the bocage country. If you have seen photographs of the Normandy interior, you have seen the bocage. Earthen banks 4 feet high, topped with hedges and trees that grew up to 15 feet. Broken into tiny rectangular fields 300 feet across. By 1944, the root systems were 3 to 12 feet deep, and the embankments were essentially small fortifications, each one a natural defensive position. The German defenders withdrawing into this terrain did what the bocage was perfect for. They turned every field into a separate kill zone. What followed between June 12th and July 25th was the kind of fighting that does not get into the highlight reels of the war. There were no panzer charges. There were no 1,000-bomber raids. There were 10,000 small fights in 10,000 small fields between American squads and German squads who could not see each other, until they were close enough to hear each other breathe. The American advance slowed to roughly a mile a day, at a casualty cost that was, in some divisions, worse per yard than anything experienced in the First World War. And here is where the second piece of the puzzle started to become visible. German junior officers writing reports during that period, and German prisoners interrogated afterward, kept describing the same phenomenon. They would set up a machine gun nest behind a hedge bank. They would take fire from somewhere on their flank that they could not locate. The fire would come from a position that, by their training, an American squad should not have known to occupy. They would shift to engage that fire and then take more fire from their other flank, from another position they had not anticipated. They would maneuver to escape the crossfire and find themselves cut off from the rear by a third American group that had infiltrated through a hedge bank 100 meters behind them. By the time they understood what was happening, they were either dead or surrendering. The German officers writing those reports kept reaching for the same word: improvised, improvised. The Americans were not following a recognizable plan. They were not maneuvering by any pattern the Germans had been trained to identify. They were just showing up where the Germans did not expect them, having made decisions that no one could trace back to a written order. The reason this confused the Germans is that by 1944, the Wehrmacht knew exactly what an Auftragstaktik unit was supposed to look like in action. It was supposed to look like a German unit. It was supposed to have a clear leader, a captain, a lieutenant, occasionally a senior NCO, making decisions and pushing those decisions down to the squad level through a recognizable chain. What the Germans were watching in the hedgerows did not have a clear leader, or rather, it had a leader that kept changing depending on the situation. Sometimes the squad leader was making the call. Sometimes it was a corporal. Sometimes, a German prisoner reported with what sounded almost like disbelief. It was a private. A private who had spotted an opportunity, communicated with two of his friends, and acted on his own initiative without a single word from his sergeant. This was happening because of something the United States Army had never written down as a doctrine, because it did not have to. It was something the American men had brought with them from somewhere else. I want to introduce you to one of those men. His name was Sergeant Curtis Cullen. Before the war, he had been a sales promotion assistant for a liquor distributor in Cranford, New Jersey. He had no engineering background. He was 29 years old. He had a quiet manner and a habit of listening to other men's complaints without interrupting, and then saying something useful 3 days later. The complaint he was listening to in early July 1944 was the bocage. Specifically, that when an American Sherman tank tried to climb over one of those hedge banks, the tank's belly exposed itself to the Germans on the other side. The Sherman's belly armor was the thinnest part of the vehicle. A Panzerfaust team in the next field could destroy a tank by simply waiting for its underside to tilt up toward them. The result was that armor could not effectively support infantry in the hedgerows. During a brainstorming session in his tank battalion, a soldier from Tennessee named Roberts said, half-jokingly, "Why don't we put saw teeth on the front of the tank and just cut through the damn things?" Most of the men laughed. Cullen did not. He went out to the wreckage of the Normandy beaches, salvaged steel from the German, Czech hedgehog, anti-invasion obstacles, cut the steel into prongs, and welded the prongs onto the bow of a Sherman. He invited his battalion commander to watch the demonstration. On July 14th, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley himself came to see what Cullen had built. He watched a Sherman accelerate to 10 miles an hour, hit a hedge bank, and drive through it. Not over it, through it, keeping its belly hidden. Bradley ordered immediate mass production. Within 11 days, by the launch of Operation Cobra on July 25th, approximately 500 Rhino devices had been welded onto American tanks. A liquor salesman with a welding torch had solved a problem the rest of an army group had been throwing battalions of infantry at for 6 weeks. I tell you about Cullen because his story is the same story as the leaderless squads on Omaha Beach, just at a different scale. The American military system had, almost by accident, created a culture in which an enlisted sergeant looking at a problem felt entitled. That is the right word, entitled, to solve it. Not to wait for someone to solve it, not to defer the solution to an engineer somewhere up the chain, to solve it himself with whatever was lying around, and then to demonstrate the solution to a three-star general. Where did this come from? It did not come from a manual. The American Army did not have an auftragstaktik tradition. The American Officer Corps in 1939 had been small, sleepy, and rigidly hierarchical. The infantry training manuals of the early war years were detailed and prescriptive in a way that German manuals were not. American doctrine on paper told sergeants what to do. German doctrine on paper told sergeants to figure it out. But the American sergeants weren't reading the manual. The American sergeants were the products of something the manual could not capture. They were the products of a country that had spent 150 years telling its young men that they did not need permission. Volunteer fire departments, pick-up baseball games organized in vacant lots without an adult in sight, farm boys who had been running the family combined since the age of 14. Auto mechanics who had taken apart Model T engines on the kitchen table. Construction workers who had built barns in two-day raisings without a single set of architectural drawings. The country that produced the American infantry of 1944 was a country in which solving problems on your own without asking a superior was not a special talent. It was a daily habit. It was a national reflex. When you put a man with that reflex into a uniform and gave him a rifle, the manual receded. The rifle was just another tool. The objective was just another barn that needed building. He looked at the situation and he did the thing. The Germans had no equivalent cultural input. The German youngster of the 1930s had been raised in a society that valued obedience to legitimate authority as a moral virtue. In a state that had spent a decade systematically telling him that the Führer thought for the nation. His auftragstaktik training, when he received it, was a doctrinal overlay on a cultural foundation that was the opposite of what the doctrine required. He could be taught to take initiative, but every other signal in his life was telling him that initiative was a dangerous thing for a man without rank. The German private in 1944 would wait for his sergeant. The American private in 1944 increasingly often did not even wait for himself. He just moved. There is a quote that has become almost a cliché in American military circles, attributed to an unnamed German general after the war. It goes like this: the reason the American Army does so well in wartime is that war is chaos, and the American Army practices it on a daily basis. It is usually told as a joke. Sometimes as an insult, sometimes as a backhanded compliment. But the German general, whoever he actually was reaching for something real. He was trying to describe what it felt like to fight a force whose internal organization looked from the outside like complete disorder, and which kept producing coordinated tactical results anyway. He was watching mission tactics being practiced by men who had never read the manual on mission tactics because they did not need to. The Germans had a doctrine that aspired to chaos. The Americans had something better. The Americans had been raised in chaos. They were already what the Germans were still trying to teach themselves to be. But this raises an obvious question. If German doctrine was so flexible, so empowering, so far ahead of every other army on Earth, why was it failing in 1944? The doctrine still existed. The manual still said the same thing. What had changed inside the Wehrmacht that meant that, just at the moment Americans were finally learning to fight, the original masters of mission tactics had stopped being able to use them? The answer to that question is the part of the story that no German general ever told publicly. They told it to each other in private, in a converted English country house where they did not know microphones were running. And what they said in those rooms is one of the most quietly devastating documents to come out of the entire war. To understand what had happened to the German army by the autumn of 1944, you have to understand who the German army had become. Look at the 352nd Infantry Division, which was actually defending Omaha Beach the morning Carlton Barrett was dragging wounded men out of the surf. The 352nd had been formed in November 1943. It was barely 7 months old. Its corps had been pulled from broken units shipped back from the Eastern Front, where the average German infantry division had a life expectancy of months, not years. Its junior officers were a patchwork of survivors and replacements. many of them men who had been promoted faster than they would ever have been in 1939 because there was no one else left. Its NCOs were green. Many of its riflemen were teenagers or men in their 40s. By mid-1944, the Eastern Front had eaten the experienced officer corps. By rough estimates, the Wehrmacht had taken something on the order of 3 million casualties in Russia by the time of D-Day. The men who die first in any army are the men who lead from the front. Auftragstaktik demanded leaders who led from the front, so Auftragstaktik was killing its own practitioners. Every successful German company commander who exposed himself to read the situation got killed reading the situation, and was replaced by a man who had never been to the front before, who therefore did not have the experience to read it, and who was therefore more likely to either die or default to following whatever the manual said. The doctrine was eating itself. There was a second problem, and the second problem was worse: Hitler. In the early years of the war, when Auftragstaktik was working at full power, the German High Command let its generals fight their own battles. By 1942, after the first reverses on the Eastern Front, this had begun to change. By 1944, it had completely inverted. Hitler had personally taken control of operational decisions down to the battalion level in some sectors. The infamous "no withdrawal without my permission" orders. The obsessive micromanagement from the Wolf's Lair. The firing of any general who showed independent judgment. Manstein, Rundstedt, all dismissed and recalled and dismissed again, had broken the trust at the heart of the system. A German divisional commander in 1944 could no longer be confident that his initiative would be rewarded. He could only be confident that a wrong call would end his career, possibly his life, and that the safer choice was always to wait for an explicit order from above. Auftragstaktik requires trust. Trust between the commander and the commanded. Hitler had spent 2 years systematically destroying the trust. By the time the Western Allies landed in France, the German command system had become, in practice, the opposite of what its doctrine required. And on December 22nd, in a small Belgian crossroads town called Bastogne that the German army had completely surrounded, the inversion produced a moment that has become a part of American folklore. The 101st Airborne Division was in Bastogne because of one of the great improvised reactions of the entire war. When the German Ardennes offensive broke through on December 16th, the 101st was in reserve in France, refitting. Within hours, men were being loaded onto trucks. Within a day, the division, minus its commanding general who was in the United States, was driving through freezing weather to a town none of them had heard of, with no clear orders about what to do when they got there. The acting commander was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the artillery commander, suddenly responsible for a division-sized defense of a critical road junction, with 3 German corps closing on him from multiple directions. McAuliffe did not wait for instructions. He looked at the map, identified Bastogne as the road hub the Germans needed for their drive on Antwerp, and decided his job was to deny it to them no matter what. He set up a perimeter and largely got out of the way of his battalion commanders, who got out of the way of their company commanders, who got out of the way of their platoon leaders, who, often as not, got out of the way of their sergeants. On December 22nd, 4 German soldiers under a white flag walked into the American perimeter, carrying a written ultimatum demanding the honorable surrender of Bastogne within 2 hours, or the Americans would face annihilation by total artillery fire. The note was passed to McAuliffe. He read it. According to the men present, he said almost to himself, "Oh, nuts." Then he asked his staff how he should reply. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard suggested that his first reaction had been pretty good. McAuliffe wrote his official reply on a piece of paper. It said in its entirety, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." The Germans, when the note was delivered, did not understand. The American officer who brought the reply had to explain that nuts was, in this context, an emphatic refusal. The Germans, accustomed to an army where surrenders were either ordered or refused through proper channels, had never encountered a reply quite like this. Written by a brigadier general acting on his own authority, with no consultation of higher headquarters, in language not approved by any military regulation in any army on Earth. They had encountered the American command system at full power, Bostonia held. Patton's Third Army, which had performed its own astonishing improvisation, a 90-degree pivot of 3 divisions in winter conditions in less than 48 hours, broke through to the perimeter on the day after. Christmas. The German offensive collapsed. In May 1945, after the German surrender, the British and American intelligence services were in possession of one of the strangest collections of documents produced in the entire war. They were the recordings of secret conversations between captured senior German officers held at Trent Park. What they kept coming back to, in the way men return to a wound that will not heal, was something more uncomfortable. One general described American troops as a phenomenon they could not categorize. He said on the recording that the Americans seemed to be making decisions faster than his men could observe them. When asked how this was possible, his answer was almost philosophical. He said that the Americans appeared to be a different kind of soldier, not better trained, not braver, not more disciplined, but freer. Free. He used the word the way a man uses a word he has been turning over in his head for a long time, without finding a better one. The American squad that confused Captain Holman in the Ardennes that morning was not operating without orders. Its men had absorbed the orders so completely, in such a clear understanding of what their lieutenant had wanted before he died and what the larger battle required, that they did not need to be told what to do next. They were the doctrine. Each one of them was, in his own piece of the line, both the commander and the commanded. There was no chain of command to point to because the chain of command had become 12 men deep and was running on a frequency the Germans did not have a receiver for. So here is the answer to the question Captain Holman asked in the snow. Were Fuhit dies Männer? Who is commanding these men? Nobody, and everybody. The answer was both at once. And the Germans could not see it because their entire doctrinal vocabulary had only the first half. The man in charge of those men was the man on the left of the sergeant, and the man on the right of the sergeant and the sergeant himself, and the private with the bar and the rifleman in the drainage ditch, and the wounded man propping himself up on his elbow to keep firing until the others could move. None of them outranked the others in any way that mattered. All of them outranked the situation. That was the secret. The Germans never broke it because there was nothing to break. There was no code. There was just 12 men who had been raised, long before they ever put on a uniform, in a country that had never taught them how to wait. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.